Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you part 2 of my review of the new Sony FE 35mm F1.8. Now, if you missed the first part of the video episode, I recommend that you start by taking a look at that. And in that review episode, we took a look at the build and the features of the lens, and then also a close examination of autofocus performance for both stills and video. And so it's a great foundation from which we're going to move into part 2 today, where we're going to talk about the image quality, we're going to look at some of the video performance, as well as give you a final verdict on the lens after having used it for a while. So obviously this lens falls into a kind of a trio of other lenses with a maximum aperture of f1.8. Those include the 55mm f1.8 along with the 85mm f1.8 lenses that all kind of follow a somewhat similar blueprint when it comes to the build, handling, and general size and shape of the lenses. In many ways, these lenses have been amongst Sony's most popular on FE because they hit a sweet spot when it comes to size and not being so expensive as to be out of reach of the average photographer. That's not to say that they're inexpensive, they aren't, but relative to the f1.4 GM, or in the case of 50mm planar or the 35mm Distagon lenses, those all are considerably more expensive, typically fairly close to, twice as expensive. And so that has left many photographers choosing with the moderate f1.8 aperture, but they're a cut above inexpensive f1.8 lenses that might have cheaper focus systems, poorer build, and poorer image quality. These are premium lenses, howbeit with a smaller maximum aperture than what many people associate with professional grade lenses. And so today we're going to take a closer look at the image quality from the 35mm f1.8. And of course 35mm is an incredibly important focal length. For many people it will be their preferred focal length for a lot of situations, and it's a great pairing for a lens like an 85mm, for example, that gives you, if you're a portrait shooter, for example, gives you a wider way to frame a scene, and then a more close one with the 85mm. So let's jump in and let's take a look at how the image quality holds up from this new lens. So we're going to start by examining our distortion and vignette here. And so on the left, I have purposely unselected the profile from the raw image. And so just so you know, typically it will look more like the right image in that the profile will be automatically activated, at least in Adobe products. And so, but anyway, if you remove that, what we can see is that there is only a very, very minor amount of pincushion distortion that's there, and that it corrects out, obviously, pretty easily there. No major problems there. As far as the vignette goes, it's not incredibly heavy in the corners. You can see it extends fairly far into the frame, and the profile does a pretty good job of correcting for it. Now, if we compare the RAW version with the JPEG version, we can see that we achieve a fairly similar result in terms of the vignette and, the distortion correction. And so you're going to end up with nice and clean images either way. So if we look at center of the frame sharpness, we can see that our resolution is quite good. Contrast is good, though not exceptional, and you can see that there's still some area for improvement and that the darks aren't as dark as what they could be, the brights aren't as bright. If we move off towards the edge of the frame, we can see that towards the corners there is some drop off. Mid-frame here looks pretty good. The extreme corners are a little bit softer. Mid-frame here in the middle also looks pretty good. And we'll take a look at one more corner, and we can see there is a little bit of softening in the extreme corner. But throughout most of the frame, resolution and contrast looks fairly good, wide open. So taking that into a real world situation, we can see on the left at f1.8 that our resolution here looks quite good. Contrast looks fairly good. On the right side, we have got a stop down to f5.6, a more typical landscape aperture. And what we can see is there's just more evidence of more contrast above all else. And I'm sure resolution is up here, but really the big difference that I see is when it comes to contrast. Contrast has been boosted by stopping the lens down. Here's another real-world f1.8 example, and so once again we can see that We're actually doing a pretty good job resolving fine details there in the center of the frame. Towards the edge of the frame, mid-frame, it's still actually fairly decent here in a real-world situation. Take a look at the other side, and we can see that the same is true there. As we've seen before, there's just room for a little bit of a contrast uptick. Finally, one more wide open real world image, and so here I have cooled it for effect because I like the look, but you can see center of the frame, again, contrast looks pretty good in the bark of the trees. As we move off towards the edges, it's, a little bit softer here, and as we move down towards the corner, we're kind of also moving out of depth of field somewhat, and so you can't judge it as precisely, but it's the pattern seems to be pretty consistent at varying focus distances. Now from f2 to f2.8, we can take a look and see that now we're starting to dial into higher contrast and resolution here at f2.8, and the center is looking really exceptionally sharp. Moving down here into the corners, we can see that there is sharpness that's starting to reach into the extreme corners and better contrast here. It's still not at the center levels, and mid-frame is about the same. It's a little bit improved, but not as, it's not equal across the frame with what we see in the center of the frame. So just out of curiosity, we'll compare it at f2.8, and this is the uncorrected version with the Tamron 35mm f2.8. Now, the Tamron only opens up to f2.8, so this represents wide open for it, and so it lacks the light gathering potential of the Sony, which, by the way, does become a factor when it comes to focus in low light. That's the biggest area that I've noted a difference. So what we can see is that whereas the Sony shows a bit of pincushion, you can see the curvature down, the Tamron shows about an equivalent amount of barrel distortion, and so you can see the curvature goes the other direction. Both of them correct fine. So as far as the resolution here, in the center of the frame, I would give an edge to the Sony at this point. It's stopped down a little bit more. You can see its contrast is just a little bit better. You can see in this block here that I prefer the look of the Sony. Moving off to the edge of the frame, I find the same to be true here, that the Sony has a bit of an advantage here when it is stopped down, obviously. And so while there's not much of a difference here in the extreme corners, the Tamron is fairly close in the extreme corners. I would say they're probably about equal, but in a lot of the frame, the Sony has a little bit of an advantage. From f2.8 to f4 here on the Sony, we can see that the center of the frame looks just a little bit better still. You can see contrast has bumped up just a little bit more. Mid-frame looking a hair better. If we look down in the corner, we can see that it is looking better, not equal to the center performance, but you can see that the resolution is looking a little bit stronger there. Moving on to f5.6, we can see just a minor uptick in the corner, getting a little bit better, and so a little progress there. And if we move on to f8, we see again just a tiny bit of progress, but probably not enough to really be reckoned with. Now, as I've come to expect on high resolution bodies like the A7R Mark III, we see that there's definitely some drop off due to diffraction when you stop down to very small apertures. And so you can see here that even compared to wide open, there's less contrast and apparent resolution as a result at f22 compared to f1.8. So if we look at the bokeh quality here, we can see, taking a look at the bokeh circles, really pretty clean here. I mean, there's some of that general pattern busyness that's, really, really common when you have a, these Christmas tree light kind of test. But we can see that the inner line is really not all that defined. It's got a tiny bit of fringing around it, but not bad. And even as far as geometry goes, you can see that, it does deform a little bit towards the edges, but this is actually quite a good performance. It's still more round than it is lemon shape. If we stop it down to f2.8, I wouldn't say that the geometry is necessarily better looking than wide open. You can see that the right near the edge, it's still not completely round. And so in some ways, I found the shape at f1.8 a little bit more organic than what we can see here. You can just vaguely begin to see the beginning of the aperture blade showing. And if we stop on down to f4 here, you can see them a little bit more defined. But again, even here at f4, at this point, I think we still have pretty good geometry across the frame. Comparing f1.8 to f4 in a real world situation, we can see again that really the bokeh still looks pretty nice out in a real world situation. And we can see that, depth of field and contrast has, obviously depth of field has increased. Contrast has increased a little bit too. You can also see that there's a little bit of green fringing wide open that has corrected, that longitudinal chromatic aberration that has corrected at the smaller aperture. Another evaluation of that here on, bright and shiny objects with lots of light on them. You get a little bit of purple, you get a little bit of green, but really as we look at the main bokeh circles, I would say they're more neutral than anything. A little bit of that, kind of blue-green fringing that takes place there. But again, looking at it collectively, there's nothing that jumps out to you, your eye catching from fringing that would make you say, I don't like the look of that. I thought the bokeh on this shot was pretty nice, the way that at a close focus distance everything really melted away. So I liked the transition here. I also liked the transition on this to where I feel like it has a fairly artful feel and it's not distracting. And so overall I would say that I like the bokeh quality from this lens. Now how about for skin tones, and looking here at a portrait situation, we can see that actually I think skin tones look here quite natural, and even here at f1.8, detail for portraiture is actually good. Sometimes being over sharp and over corrected is actually a detriment for portrait work, and so I would look at this and see potential for a very nice portrait type lens. Skin tones handled well, and the rendering of the skin itself I think is quite good. Now, as far as flare resistant goes, sunlight being right up in this area. So what we can see is we've got kind of a little bit of a broad ghost / veiling pattern here that becomes more defined when stopped down to f11. However, looking at this collectively and looking at it as we pan back and forth from video, we can see that there are some flare artifacts, but flare is relatively well controlled, and general contrast isn't bad here. Now let's take a look at Coma performance, and so we can see center of the frame that our star points look fairly good here. You can see there is a tiny bit of Coma even towards the center of the frame. Just some of the geometry is just a little bit off. So move towards the edge of the frame, however, we can see that on some of these brighter points that there is, there's a little bit more Coma on evidence here. And so this is not necessarily a great performance in terms of Coma resistance. If we go on to f2, we can see, and I'll toggle back here, you can see that the wings are a little bit less defined, and moving on to f2.8, things are looking better, not perfect, but looking better. And on this really obvious one from before, it's better corrected. And so this is not the top lens that I have seen for shooting the night sky. It's not terrible, however, and if you stop it down a bit to where a lot of times, like you would be comparing to the zooms, you're getting an equivalent type result. So finally, we can see that there is a nice amount of magnification, 0.24 times magnification, which is going to be really useful in a lot of situations. And even better is that even at f1.8, our close-up image quality is quite good here. Pretty good contrast and good detail. It actually lives up to its close focus potential. So a couple of things that jump out to me from that. First of all, I didn't note it while going through the segment, but the fact that it has a little bit of a pin cushion rather than barrel distortion is actually a net positive when it comes to shooting portraits. While that distortion will be corrected in many situations, you obviously have the option to leave it uncorrected, and often portrait photographers find a little bit of pin cushion distortion to be a little bit flattering, because rather than exaggerating features, it tends to, thin things down just a little bit. And so if you're going to have distortion in either direction on a lens that you'd be using for portraits, that's certainly the preferred direction to go. On a more negative note, the biggest thing that stands out to me as a potential negative on image quality is that the corners never get what I would call pin sharp on this lens. I think they get sharp enough to where it probably won't be an issue for anyone, but certainly it's nothing like, say, the Sigma 35mm F1.2 that I reviewed a couple of months ago, where in many ways the corners were pretty much as sharp as what the center was, even at f1.2 and f1.4. And so that's not really the case here, and so you're going to have to shoot at landscape apertures to get truly sharp corners. And so if that's a big deal to you, it might be something worth considering. That being said, for many people with most of what they do, The sweet spot of sharpness in the center half or 2/3 of the frame is probably going to be sufficient for you, and so, you know, you'll have to, your mileage may vary, as the saying goes, so you'll have to evaluate that for yourself. So let's jump in and let's also take a look at the video performance here and see how this lens functions as a video related lens. As we saw in our first episode, video pulls are nice and smooth, video focus is very quiet, and as a byproduct of that, this is obviously a nice lens to use for video in that the focus is confident, it's not hunting. And you can see here that even under windy conditions and our subjects moving around, that focus is holding. Also, for just general purpose shooting, obviously this is a flexible focal length that you can use either for the full view, but also for APS-C Super 35 and being a very nice focal length for various work. And so I found that when doing video work with it, I was very happy with the look of the footage, which you can see is nice and crisp, and hopefully it makes you feel very cold, because that will help you to appreciate how cold I was when getting all of this footage. So once again, as we saw in the first episode, where focus is very silent, very confident, and focus pulls are really nice and smooth, this is certainly a great little video lens. And that's actually enhanced by the fact that, unlike some mirrorless lenses, the actual focus ring here is linear in nature. And so it means that you can get a little bit more consistent focus pulls, and also you can get a little bit faster focus pulls than what you can with some mirrorless lenses. And so I think positives on both of those fronts. It's also obviously lightweight and compact, and so it's going to be an easy lens to put on a gimbal as well. So in conclusion, there's a lot that I really love about this lens. I love the form factor. I think it feels nicely built. I would say that the only challenge that really is going to be there for some people is when it comes to the price point. Not that in an absolute sense it's incredibly expensive. At $799, it is a moderately priced lens. However, the market to which it is being released is not the same as when, say, the 35mm F1.8 sonar lens was released. And by the way, it does seem that Sony has moved away from the partnership with Zeiss, at least to the extent that we no longer see Zeiss branding on these type lenses, nor do we get any of the Zeiss optical formula names like planar, sonar, distagon associated with these lenses any longer. And so, at that point, I think that in some ways, when it entered the market with the 55mm, there was relatively few lenses available for the system. The Zeiss name, people are accustomed to paying a bit of a premium for that. At this stage, however, that Zeiss branding is gone, and the market is much more saturated with alternatives at this point. And so I think that, Sony does face a little bit more of an uphill perception battle, at the very least, when it comes to the price point of this particular lens. At the same time, however, I have, of course, used most of the alternatives, and I would say, having spent time with them, that this is probably a more premium lens than most of the alternatives. It's got an extremely nice build. It's got exceptionally good autofocus that's a cut above, has a few more features than what alternatives I've seen, and so that may not be enough to offset the additional price to you, but at the same time, I feel like you are getting fairly solid value for money. And if this lens, it's currently priced at $799 US, and I think that if it was priced even at $699, it would be pretty close to a no-brainer at that point. And if it was priced more similarly to the 85mm F1.8, I think that they would have a hard time keeping it in stock. And so that's, of course, a call that Sony's got to make. But at the same time, I don't feel like you're getting ripped off if you purchase this lens. And I'm not surprised when I've heard that some people who have evaluated some of the other alternatives and they've settled on this, even though it has a smaller maximum aperture. It really is, it's very sharp, it's very useful even at that. And at the end of the day, size is still a real issue for a lot of photographers. It may not be for you, and if it's not, I completely understand. But for a lot of photographers it is, and I think that Sony has found a pretty nice sweet spot here of delivering size and performance that is a very nice match. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, I do have linkage to a full text review. I also have linkage there to a photo gallery if you want to look at more photos. I've shown you some in this review. There's more there to see, and there's also buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, and linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.